Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Nautical Nights. Starting to feel like we're on a radio talk show. Just before we get the evening going, a couple of housekeeping items. I know for those of you who've joined a few times already, this is just like riding a horse. So for those of you who haven't joined before, in order to participate in this conversation with John Brebner this evening, we ask that you use the YouTube chat to send in your questions. If you're not able to access the YouTube chat, you're more than welcome to send your questions to marmuse@marmuseum.ca. The link to that email address will be provided in the YouTube chat, but it's marmus@marmuseum.ca. Before we get started, we're very grateful this evening to have Ross Cameron, for the past Commodore from the Kingston Yacht Club, join us this evening. So I'm going to hand this over to Ross, who's going to provide an introduction to the series. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Michelle. KYC is really proud to have a partnership with the Marine Museum to host this series, even virtually, where we aren't able to use the speaking space that KYC has. It's a very important thing for us to do. This happens to be Kingston Yacht Club's 125th anniversary this year, and we're celebrating that throughout the year. And we hope to. It's a place where sailing, but a recognition of history has been on and on and on. So we look forward to celebrating that with the community. There's a little small cadre of people that pulled this thing together. They were historian Dave Moore and Doug Cowie from the museum, and me. And to see it now flourishing as it is a wonderful thing. Welcome to the speaker series.
Thank you very much, Ross. And on behalf of the Marine Museum, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. As Ross mentioned, the Nautical Night Speaker Series has been going on for a couple of years now, a few years now. And this year, we're very grateful to have extended it into the 7 speakers for the winter series. And we'll look forward to introducing you to the next couple. This is now the 4th one, but we normally will be having a spring and autumn series as well. And I invite you to keep an eye on our social media pages and in the newsletter for that information. So this evening we have John Brebner joining us to discuss the Sandbanks, which is a topic that I'm sure many of you who are joining us this evening have fond memories of. So a little introduction to John. While born in Scotland, John grew up in Kingston. After giving electrical engineering a try at Queen's University, he soon realized photography was his preferred career path. And after managing his own photography studio in Kingston for a number of years, this route soon took him to Ottawa to be a photographer with a communications research center. Here, he was able to work with commercial film and print processing equipment, as well as having a fully equipped photographic lab with the best in analog film equipment. Close-up photography, infrared, and UK light, and the digitization of archival negative stock became his specialty. Between 1988 and 2012, John immersed himself in the study of the Brebner genealogies from the northeast of Scotland and eventually worldwide, and was able to take hundreds of cousins in their own search for ancestors through detailed research on his definitive genealogy website. The move to digital imaging and the nascent Canadian Space Agency, the CRC, proved to be a great place to learn all about digital technology. For almost 20 years, John continued with this learning curve before retiring in 2012 after 32 years following the federal government's downsizing. Not one to sit around, he joined the Friends of CRC, that's the Communications Research Center, a retired group of scientists and technologists interested in preserving the history of Canadian radio research and space history. John has been the chairman of that organization since 2013. At the same time, John revisited a favorite spot from his childhood, and one that we all recall, I'm sure, very fondly, the Sandbanks of Prince Edward County. Here he began photographing and cataloging the natural history, the geology, and the historic human effects in this area since the advent of the Loyalists and Quakers in 1784. John then joined the Friends of Sandbanks and became their media relations coordinator, unofficial historian, photographer, and genealogist of the early Prince Edward County families. His collection of Prince Edward genealogies is rapidly becoming a must-look research tool for any county genealogist. I'll put my linguistic skills to the test here this evening. History and genealogy, in particular, can be a very addictive study. John has put his skills in photography and video production to make a number of short videos about the Sandbanks, but his longer production of Driving the Danforth Road will be his most ambitious film yet, and I'm sure he will touch upon that this evening. So without further ado, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming virtually John Brebner to the screen. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That was a wonderful introduction. It sounds like I might have even written that myself. Let me just hang on, fiddling with this. I had this a minute ago. I know everybody hates this sort of thing when people are fiddling with slides, but let's do this, and away we go. So. You've heard mostly about me. I've spent, as I say, the last 8 years down at the Prince Edward County Sandbanks, taking photographs and talking to people and just generally learning about the early history and the geology. I was never very much one for history at school. I didn't think it was taught very well at KCVI. But the older I get, the more I enjoy the roots of where we come from and where we're going. You're looking here at a very simple map which shows Kingston and the Sandbanks for those of you who don't know where it is. Michelle mentioned that probably most people who'd lived in Kingston, certainly over the last 50 years, often made pilgrimages to the Sandbanks to with their friends and their girlfriends and the cases of beer and what have you. So it's a fairly familiar spot. The bottom,
John.
Yes.
Just sorry, I don't mean to cut in. You mentioned a map, but the screen hasn't shared yet.
Oh, okay.
Try it again.
Are you seeing anything there now?
No.
Okay, just hang on. We'll get this yet. Too many buttons. Too many buttons.
Here it comes.
Okay, and we'll just do.
So that's the full PowerPoint screen.
Yeah. We'll get rid of that and get into the other screen there in just a second. Okay, that should do it. Does that work?
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, all right.
Thank you for your patience, everyone.
I apologize for that. You know, you would think with all the years of technology that I could work a PowerPoint, but what can I say? You know, old age. All right, so here we go again. This is the map, and I won't get into the details again. Below, the image below shows the Sandbanks as it is today. This is a view from Westlake looking west into Lake Ontario. And the dunes in the foreground there are what's left of the original sand dunes. You can see they do have some cover on them, some ground cover. And I'll show you some slides later of what it looked like after the farmers had basically stripped it of all the vegetation. So the presentation will discuss the early geology, the last ice age, how the dunes were formed, pre-Columbian settlement, European settlement, how the dunes were deforested, the Barley Days, farming, fishing, and tourism, and what's happening in the 20th century. So let's go back a few million years, 450 million years, to Pangaea. Pangaea was the original sort of large continent from which all the other continents drifted from to form what we have today in the world. Pangaea, the area at the Sandbanks was covered with this limestone because the area was at the time just above the equator, so it was a tropical sea 450 million years ago. You can see in the map on the right where the Sandbanks is, and we're so close to Casablanca we could sort of drive there in 3 hours. I'm going to talk briefly about the limestone. On the left, we're showing West Point. West Point is the southernmost point of the Westlake Sandbar, and that's one of the few places where you can see limestone at the Sandbanks. The photograph on the right shows it's very, very, very crumbly. I just want to note you can see how thick the soil depth is. It's not very thick. There are areas. Much of Prince Edward County is covered with soil. It's only a foot or so thick. So let's get to the ice age. There have been several ice ages, but the last one is the one we want to talk about. And we'll discuss this because the extent of the ice sheet, the height, the terminal moraine, which is the most important factor that brought us today's Sandbanks, and glacial Lake Iroquois. So here we have a map showing the extent of the Laurentide Glacier at about 14,000 BCE. You can see it goes to just south of Rochester and Oswego, and that's where all the really good soil got scraped to. We ended up with slightly lesser soil in Prince Edward County. You'll note on there a place called Pancake Hill. Just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. I'm sure many of you have never heard of it, but it does have an interesting relationship to the Sandbanks. The glacier at maximum, this shows a sort of a comparison of the height of the sheet at Sandbanks or Toronto. It was about 2 to 2.5 kilometers. The CN Tower was slightly less than half a kilometer, so you can see how thick it was. Now, the ice was much thicker if you went further north. It was 5 or 6 kilometers thick when you went as far north as Hudson's Bay. So this gives you an idea, sort of a profile view. And again, we have from the left the thick ice to the thinner ice covering Lake Ontario and the terminal moraine just south of Oswego. Pancake Hill, again, I marked it there because it was the northern shore of glacial Lake Iroquois. Now we can see that here. If I'm going too fast, Michelle, just sort of wave and I'll slow down. Okay, good. This gives us an idea of the extent of glacial Lake Iroquois. It encompassed a much larger area than Lake Ontario and was considerably so the lake was considerably deeper. This is an outline of glacial Lake Iroquois, and again we show some of the normal places, the typical landmarks. Pancake Hill was was a beach on the shores of glacial Lake Iroquois, and I suggest that it's a great place to visit because it gives you an idea of how deep glacial Lake Iroquois was. This shows more or less today's view of Lake Ontario and relationship. And here is Pancake Hill. It's just southwest of Thomasburg, north of Belleville on Highway 62. And if you drive up there, it's at the top of a hill, obviously Pancake Hill, which is a series of layers of depositions of these terminal moraines that have been washed by the beach of glacial Lake Iroquois. And if you have a chance to go up there in the summer on a clear day and go up and just stand anywhere in that picture on the right, you can see this is a view looking northwest, but you can see on a clear day, you can see almost down to Lake Ontario. And it gives you an idea of the extent of the ice sheet. All the stuff that the glacier scraped down, it left on its way down, from the little stones, the little igneous rocks, and all the stuff that was scraped off the Canadian Shield, to these larger glacial erratic boulders. This one on the right here is at West Point. The composition of the sand and gravel that is found in the terminal moraine in Prince Edward County is all made up of finer grains of this very stuff. So on the left here, I'm showing a map that shows, again, the sandbanks and the direction of the ice movement. You can see I've marked off what's called the Ridge Road Moraine, and it's an elevated area which is home to a number of quarries that you can see on the right provide rough, coarse sand as well as gravel and finer materials that are still used today for cement making and road construction. Now this is a view of the Westlake Bar. This is looking north from just above West Point. In the far distance, on I call it the mainland, but on the mainland we have Wellington. You can see how much it's actually gotten covered over today. It looked very much like this, except with more tree cover back in 1800. It would have been more or less completely vegetated in 1800. It shares the distinction of being one of the, not one of, the longest baymouth bar over freshwater in the world at about 7 kilometers. So how did the dunes come about? Well, we got to go back to that glacial sand, and we have this one time, and I've emphasized that because that comes up a number of times in some discussions about the cement quarry later on, a one-time deposit of a large amount of coarse sand that came down with glaciation. The water and wave actions reduced that coarse sand into the fine beach sand that we have today. Seasonal winds, mostly in the winter, moved the finer sands, and that's what caused the sand to drift. Now, as long as there was vegetation on the sand, it was pretty well contained. And that's what happened basically by 1800, 1790, 1800. It was still pretty much vegetated and contained. But once you remove that vegetation, the sand starts to move. And here's a graphic. This comes from a Friends of Sandbanks publication, Sandscapes Exploring the Dunes of Sandbanks Provincial Park, that the Friends of Sandbanks published in 2012. This is a commercial plug, so refresh your drinks. You've got 30 seconds to do that while I tell you about Sandscapes. It's available at various bookstores in the county, Books and Company, and or through many of the members of Sandbanks. We haven't made it available online simply because the shipping costs for a $10 book are as much as the book itself. But there are some copies still available, and we'd be happy to sell you one. So that's the end of the, I hope you managed to pour a drink in that time. That's the end of the commercial. The sand, as I mentioned, is drifting mostly in the winter. And the image on the left shows the very fine sand on top of the snow cover at the Dunes Beach. And that's the only time you can really see the effect of drifting sand, aside from the occasional sort of soft, misty, dusty cloud that you may see late in the season. The image on the right is a picnic table, obviously, and this is at the outlet beach. They put up these sand fences, supposedly to contain the dunes, but they seem to do a fine job of forming a dune right behind the beach, and that's what they want. The park wants that because once you've got a dune there, then you can plant stabilizing vegetation, which will help keep the dune from moving. Every year, the parking lot at Outlet Beach has to be cleared out from drifting sand. So it's still a big problem, even with the vegetation that we have there today. So let's just talk about the dunes themselves. There's basically these 5 areas. The beach area, which is at Lake Ontario, the Four Dunes, the Pan area. The Pan is a sort of a temporary marsh area that you find in mostly in the spring. The mid dunes, which aren't mentioned on this slide, the back dunes, which are the tallest dunes on the beach, and then East or West Lake, which are both sandbars have these common features. This is an image that gives you an idea of again what I've just mentioned: the 4 dunes on the beach. The pans. Now this shot was taken in 2017, and as you all know, the Lake Ontario water level was extremely high So the pans really didn't evaporate in August like they usually do. They're based on the water table. And then we have the back dunes and Westlake. If you look at the sort of the center left side of this image, there's a sort of an elliptical shape there, and that's called an elliptical dune, which is an interesting formation made by the wind, and it moves toward, with the wind direction, moves again toward the back dunes. The park has done a considerable amount of planting and stabilization and fenced it off so that people don't go in and trample it up and loosen the sand. These are, I should mention that this feature is not uncommon. There are about 5 or 6 of them in Prince Edward County alone, going from Weller's Bay in the north all the way down to East Lake in the south, and they're also found on Amherst Island and Wolf Island, and they're all the same. They all have the fine sand beaches that were deposited by glaciation. This just gives you a profile view of what I've just finished talking about: the foredunes, the secondary dunes, the pans, and the back dunes, and that pretty well speaks for itself. So let's get down to the real problem with what's destroyed the dunes. And I shouldn't say that. It wasn't the pre-Columbian settlement. The native peoples used the sand dunes and the shores only as seasonal hunting camps. They didn't have any permanent encampments on the dunes, but you can still find artifacts, arrowheads, pottery shards, and net sinkers. Net sinkers are those small, mostly limestone stones that have had the 2 notches cut out of the center, so you can wrap a rope around them that weighs down a net. But there was actually no long-term effect on the dunes from the native peoples that lived there, probably for 1,000 years during their seasonal hunting and fishing. Here's an artist's concept of the Iroquois fishermen at the Sandbanks. This would be about 1400 in current era. On the right, we have a native pot. This was discovered by the park superintendent, Jim Ives, along the Sandbanks, way deep in where hardly anyone ever goes. But all the pieces were just lying on the surface of the sand. That's one of the beauties of the Sandbanks and archaeology. If you go back every year, you're likely to find more stuff because the sand has moved or drifted and uncovered these fragments, and conversely covered up fragments. The pot was reassembled at the Royal Ontario Museum, and it now lives in this display cabinet at the Westlake campground at the Friends of Sandbanks Park. So, European settlement and the beginning of the end for the sand dunes. The first Europeans came to Prince Edward County really were the arrival of Samuel Champlain. He was just traveling through visiting. And I've got an asterisk there because a couple of years ago, I had an interesting visit with a gentleman at the Wellington Legion who had done a lot of research on Viking settlement. And he was convinced that the Vikings had been at Consicon, which is just northwest of the Sandbanks, in about 900 AD CE. He was a little reticent. I wanted to do a video interview with him, but he was a little reticent when it came to that. So I have no idea how much truth there is in that. But there are, if you look on the internet, there are Viking artifacts that have supposedly been found east of Oswego on the beaches of Lake Ontario there. We fast forward to about 1670, and a missionary was established by the Sulpician monks who came in basically to reform the savages and give them French religion. Kente was the name of the missionary. No one is quite sure exactly where it was. It may have been near Carrying Place. It may have been near Wellington. Some people actually have it placed near the Sandbanks, but there's no actual proof as to where it was. But after 1680, everyone more or less abandoned the place. it was still wilderness. You had to imagine that this was completely deeply forested, and the only way you could get into it was by water in the summer or over the ice in the winter. And as I say, the interior was so thick with forest that only pedestrian travel was possible, and even that was extremely difficult. So that brings us to the American Revolution, and by 1784, the first emigration of settlers, both Loyalists and Quakers from the northern U.S., started moving into Prince Edward County. The first group came with Captain Van Alstyne in 1784 and settled at Adolphustown. And if you're familiar with Adolphustown, there's a park and a graveyard and a wonderful museum there that dedicated to the Loyalists and their heritage in that part of the country. The Loyalists were essentially people who had fought for the British or had supported the British and had to move out of their homes in, say, New York State simply because there was so much animus against them by the revolutionary population. So they were all given land allotments, and it turned out they were given too much. They were given allotments that didn't exist initially. So the second round of land allotments was in Prince Edward County. I just want to mention that the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who did not were a pacifist religious group, while they may have quietly supported the British, did not take up arms in their favor, but they were still penalized and they were set upon by the revolutionaries. But they weren't fortunate enough to be given land. They had to buy land when they arrived. But there was quite a lot of it available in Prince Edward County, in Marysburg, that was given to soldiers who never settled there. So they didn't have too much of a hard time finding a place to live. But the first influx of these settlers marked the beginning of the erosion of the land. So if you arrived on in this wilderness, you had a number of things you had to do, and some of these were prescribed by government if you actually wanted to keep the land. So you had to build a house, you had to clear the land, you had to remove the stumps, you had to stock firewood, you had to make potash for lye and for fertilizer, and you had to prepare a short piece of road in front of your house. This is one of my favorite fairy tale pictures, if you will. This was painted by Bowen Squires. Bowen Squires was a settler a later settler north of Consacon Lake. He was an amateur archaeologist, and he did a lot of excavation, professional grade excavations into the peoples that lived there, and had basically established that Native peoples had a village north of Lake Consacon Lake. This picture I always find amusing because I think it's entitled "The Arrival of the Loyalists" or something like that, and it shows this. It looks like they're going out to a picnic. I mean, nobody seems to have a shovel or an axe. They're all carrying twigs and what look like picnic baskets. This little girl in her Sunday finery in the blue dress in the center. These are not people who look like they're going out to cut down the forest and settle. And of course, they're being observed by Robin Hood here on the left. So it was much tougher than that. This woodcut shows the clearing of the land with oxen. Any of you who've cut down a tree know that cutting down a tree with an axe is not necessarily an easy proposition, but it's much easier than removing the stumps. Here's another woodcut. This is actually a bit of it's a bit disconcerting because it shows the pioneers cutting down trees and burning in the mid foreground. They're burning in the mid background, but all the houses are made of frame. They're not made of logs. And frame houses did not appear until they had mills, so they could mill the rough lumber into planks and boards. So, always, I guess the moral there is never believe the pictures you see. This is obviously another sort of fairly romanticized notion. I want to mention the fishing along the Westlake Bar because it was a complementary activity to the farming. And fishermen were granted, landowners were granted fishing lots along both East and West Lake. And they used sand nets, which were perfectly suited for the shallow, sandy bottoms. But they basically took all the fish out of the lake within 50 or 60 years. There are stories that at Wellington, when the smelt were running, you could walk across the water on top of them. They were so numerous. The good news is that there was no long-term effect on the beach by the fishing activities, except for the fish. This, again, is another somewhat romanticized picture of them pulling in the nets, but this is how they pulled in their seine nets. This is at Wellington, and you can see in the back, in the right middle of the image, church spire. That is the Roman Catholic Church in Wellington. Roman Catholics weren't a huge population to begin with, but a lot of Irish settlers came in later by the 1840s and swelled that population. I look at the picture from a point of view of just being of sort of fishing. They can't have been too optimistic. The lady on the shore there has got a basket that might hold 5 fish, and there seems to be counting another 5. So if that's all they got from this amount of labor, it was obviously a slow day in the fishery. So let's get on to deforesting the dunes. As I mentioned earlier, 2 slides ago, they needed to clear the land for farming. They needed obviously construction material, and they needed potash. But Prince Edward County had one other wonderful resource, and that was white pine. And the white pines were tall, straight, and very numerous. And here's one of these sort of butterfly effect types of things. In 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, just to give you a reference point in history, 1806, the Europeans were blockaded by Napoleon, and that prevented Great Britain from using its source of white pine for its navy that came from Germany and the Scandinavian countries. So they were forced to move to New Brunswick as I say, in the early 1800s, and then move to Quebec after all the pine there had been used, and then finally moved west into Prince Edward County. Here we have, just gives you an idea of the Nelson's victory and your average 100-foot, 70 to 100-foot white pine that probably came from somewhere in North America. The image on the right is the last stand of white pine really in Prince Edward County, and it's in the Society of Friends. That's the Quakers Cemetery in Bloomfield. But by 1850, that was all gone. Now, this image is basically shows what the forest cover was at the time. And just going from the left to the right, the best cedars were actually on the sand dunes. And these were the essential trees that kept the sand dunes in place. In Block H, which is the area that was owned by the McDonalds, who still farm there today, or still farm near there today, is circled in violet there. And it has a very good assortment of hardwood, hickories, oaks, elms, and so on. The best white pines were grown in the area between Westlake and Eastlake. And that's because the terminal moraine that I discussed before left an awful lot of very good soil in that area. I've shown here the mast road because what they did was they chopped down these trees. They were 60, 70, 80 feet long, and they dragged them in the mast road along to Milford, where there was a port where they could ship them down to Montreal and Quebec and then on to Britain. I marked this as being supposed. There's quite a few short articles on the mast road on the internet, but no one actually says where it was. So I followed the most logical route for it on this map. There is a possibility that it would have gone along, gone along East Lake but the only bridge across the outlet river at the time was on a sort of a Z bend in the road, and it's highly unlikely that they would have been able to maneuver a 60-foot log along that. Here are two images. They're not actually the same view, but the view on the left is from a series of 100 images taken by Arthur Richardson in the early 1920s when he first started his work of land reclamation. And you can see the state the dunes were in at the time. There are some cedars standing there. These are not cedars that were cut down. These are cedars that were actually overcome by sand and covering their roots and bark kill the trees. And some of these trees are still there, standing up, silent sentinels on the dunes. This on the right image, which was taken 4 or 5 years ago. The Erie Canal marked the beginning of ease of access to the United States. It also helped people move to Canada. It helped them travel back and forth. There was a remarkable amount of travel in the county at that time. And it was the beginning of the growth of cross-lake shipping travel. Excuse me, just 1 minute here. Quench my thirst. This slide shows the Erie Canal and its relationship to Picton and Milford, which were the main harbors on Prince Edward County at the time. I've marked the location of the McDonald Hyatt Wharf because that is where the majority of barley and wheat was shipped from that went to Oswego. And once you got to Oswego, of course, you could travel down the canal to Syracuse, down the Mohawk to Albany, and then on to New York. And the construction of the Erie Canal really made New York a major port on the eastern seaboard. Now, we've talked about the first bunch of settlers that came. The second bunch came from New Brunswick. They all went there at about the same time in 1784, but by 1815, many of them had run out of land. So they too had moved west in Prince Edward County, and it was McDonald's, among other families, that settled on that point of West Point in about 1825 that were the farmers that really had the most effect on the Sandbanks. Excuse me. The American Civil War was another impetus that really helped farmers in Prince Edward County. They taxed rum severely in order to finance the Civil War. Americans then turned to beer, which was cheaper. Consumption increased 16 times, and they were looking for sources of barley. And the best barley came from Prince Edward County, so naturally the farmers went crazy and turned everything into barley production. And I mean everything. The cattle farming was stuck on the dunes. This particular image is the only one I've been able to find of actually cattle on the dunes. But as you can see here, they've pretty well stripped it bare. There's not much left there. And of course, the sand was free to drift. I don't want to talk too much about the Barley Days because David Moore has given an excellent presentation on that. And I'm sure if you ask him, he'll be happy to give it again. But the McKinley Tariff of 1890 immediately raised the tax on barley, and the market just basically dropped overnight. Now, there's some stories that suggest that farmers were killing themselves left and right when they lost their income from the barley. That hasn't, excuse me, hasn't been proven true. Because many of them had already diversified into vegetables and canning, as well as tourism, and they had fishing for the winter, so they were actually a fairly diverse group. So let's move on again to the 19th century and farming and fishing. Tourism started to boom with the advent of the steamer. And local farmers started taking in tourists in their homes to supplement their income, because by this point, the Sandbanks had become world famous as these glowing white dunes devoid of all vegetation, which had happily happened with the settlers. Wasn't the natural state at all. But this then started the advent of tourist lodges at West Point, as well as private cottages. Here we have a small sailboat. I have no idea what type it is, but it's at West Point looking toward the Sandbanks. And the image on the right is again at West Point. You'll notice on the bottom right those limestone cliffs. That's the same limestone bluff that was shown in my earlier slide, showing the rubble limestone at West Point. On the left here, we have an early image of the Lakeshore Lodge. It was one of the first purpose-built lodges for the Sandbanks, and it was basically the Hilton of the day. Sport fishing was obviously a big deal, and obviously if you caught one of these, it would have literally, with 40 loaves and fishes, fed the multitudes. I haven't seen them that large in Westlake these days. Here we have the steamer Geronia. The steamers docked in Picton, and the tourists were picked up by horse and carriage and driven to Westlake and to the Lakeshore Lodge and the lodges on Westlake. It was interesting. Wellington at the time didn't have an established harbor that would take vessels that size, but it did allow for tourists to come by horse and buggy from Wellington across the sands to the Lakeshore Lodge. The Evergreen House was a slightly lower class establishment. It was more frequented by locals and fishermen and rowdy card players and drinkers and what have you, all the people that I really enjoy. It was more of a sort of a saloon than a proper hotel. You can see on the image on the right the owner standing there as the sand was about to overtake the house. There's a lot of myths about the house that it was buried under the sand. That's not true. They took down the house. They took all the boards away, and they used the boards to build cottages for the Lakeshore Lodge. The foundations may still be there, but they'd be down around 50 feet, under about 50 feet of sand. Here we have another view, again the same view, showing the west from West Point, showing a happy family. Excuse me. On the right, just notice that there's a limestone rock. That was the actual shoreline back then. This rock that the folk are sitting on is now a little island of its own. So you have to get your feet wet if you want to go out to it today. And here, of course, is a politically incorrect photograph, postcard, and I'll leave you to interpret that however you will. But the advent of the automobile did after World War I really pushed the tourism to new levels, and this amorous couple were probably just among many that went to the sand dunes for let's just say they went there for a picnic. Here's the Lakeland Lodge. This is on West Point, and this was a very family-oriented lodge. It was built by the McDonald family, who I say are still there. The only building left on the site is the ruin of the farmhouse, which is, if you look in the middle of the image, and it's the third Red Roof Inn. That's the only building still extant today. You'll note the orchard at the back. They raised apples. They had a canning factory in conjunction with the Hyatt family, who they had a sort of a love-hate relationship with over the decades. But they were all very diversified farmers. This is a map that just sort of gives you an idea of the number of lodges and cottages. They're all gone, with the exception of Lakeview House is a ruin. It's the Hyatt House. Lakeshore Lodge is a ruin. Maple Rest was recently restored with help from the Friends of Sandbanks, and On the right-hand side, Martin's Outlet was recently bought, and it's now Sandbanks River Country, and it's a very nice sort of a seasonal trailer park. They do have cottages and so on. The Palace of the Moon was a famous dance hall where you brought your booze and you danced and smoked cigarettes. I've never been able to locate exactly where it is, but that's one of my little geological projects that I'm looking at. So I have a vague idea, but I've talked to a number of people who actually went dancing there, but whether they had drunk too much to remember the location in their later years or memory has just failed them, I don't know. So let's move on to the 20th century, because conservation, the farmers were getting really annoyed by 1900 because they were losing farmlands, and they had done a certain amount of planting willows and what have you. And if you see willow trees around the Sandbanks today, and there are quite a few back in the dunes and along County Road 12, you can see the mature trees that were planted back 120 years ago. But Amos MacDonald wasn't happy with what was being done by the farmers, so he petitioned the Ontario government to do something. And finally, in 1921, the province appointed Arthur Richardson to come and fix up the sand and stop the drift. Now, Arthur Richardson was known as Mr. Conservation, but let's be perfectly clear. He wasn't in the business to come and conserve the sand dunes. His job was to stop sand drifting over County Road 12 and ruining the taxpayers' land. However, the nursery did produce thousands of trees for transplanting, and the effects of those trees are still visible today. This just gives you a bit of a timeline about the nursery itself. As I say, they tried snow fences, they tried different kinds of trees, they tried barrier fences of planks and lath, mulching and heavy plantings of Carolina poplar. A lot of the Carolina poplar is still there. And by 1965, they had decided that they'd done enough and things were pretty good. After 1965, with the establishment of the Ontario Park System, the park undertook to do a lot of plantings of trees and marram grass, maples and butternut. The image here, and I just mentioned this because it's this on the left is the Sandbanks Nursery. That was on the Lakeshore Lodge Road, and these are the seedlings, some of which are now 80 feet tall, that you can view on the dogleg of the County Road 12 near the Sandbanks. The image on the right gives you an idea of how desolate it was looking across the dunes. This is looking, again, sort of northeast from the tallest dunes by Dunes, what is now Dunes Beach. And you can see the snow fencing and the other types of fencing and some of the willow plantings and poplar plantings that they tried to do to mitigate the drift. On the left, we have Arthur Richardson. There's a number of photographs of him. You usually see him in his Boy Scout outfit, but I thought it was more suitable to show him as he was as a naturalist and a scientist. This shows this is from an aerial photograph about 1950. And you can see the rows of trees and fences and borders. Up at the top, near the top there, just under the title, we have the pine planting that is still there on County Road 12. It's a block of perfectly uniform rows of pine trees. At the bottom, you can see where Richardson's nursery was. There's nothing left of that at all. That's now the Richardson's campground in the park. I just put this in as a quick slide to show how the roads had to be moved. The 1852 road more or less came straight from Westlake and went straight to what would then become the site of the Lakeshore Lodge. And you can see over the years how it was moved as the sand came in to the final 1922 road, which is in green, and the slight modification of the road in 1965 when they started work on Sandbanks Park. Here again is the Sandbanks Nursery on the left, and this, excuse me, another shot of them poplars and plantings. Interesting enough, every one of Arthur Richardson's photographs has this mysterious figure with a bag over his shoulder for scale. I'm not sure who it is, but he appears in every photograph that Richardson took in this series. Now here's a perfect example of a then and now, and I like then and now pictures because they make such a it's so interesting to see the comparison, because it kind of sneaks up on you when you live through it. On the left, this is about 1955. I don't have a date, but it shows again the looking. This is looking southwest from Westlake, and on the right, what it is today. It's not usually that swampy. The Pan area, again, this was taken in 2017 when the water levels were extremely high. But you can see what a difference it's made in vegetation in the last 60 or 70 years. Industry had a very small part to play at the sand dunes, but a very large part in the destruction of the dunes. Not so much the Westlake Brick Factory, which was the first industry to be established there, but certainly the Canada Cement Sand Quarry, which removed pretty much everything of the tallest sand dune that was in the park before public opinion made them close their operations. And by 1970, all the industrial operations in the park had ceased. Lakeshore Lodge, unfortunately, was going to be restored. If you do a Google search, you'll find a number of articles on various restoration plans. It was unfortunately destroyed by fire on Halloween of 1983. Vandalism was suspected. You can go to the site on West Point, and the foundations are there, and there's a number of very good informational plaques, again furnished by the Friends of Sandbanks, that allow you to get an idea of the history. And it was really the spot to go from 1890 even till 1950. Although after 1950 it had gone sort of settled down a bit on its it was sort of lost a bit of its luster because international travel had become far more popular. Here we have the Westlake Brick Factory with the sand dune, and again, popular stories will tell you that the sand dune covered the Westlake Brick Factory, and that's why it stopped operations. No, that's not quite the case. It stopped operation because the brick it made wasn't very good. It suffered from efflorescence. You couldn't use it in damp areas, and it was no good. The sand was no good for anything else. Too much mica in it and iron in it for glass making. So it was abandoned in 1926. There are still remains, and I find it's amazing that you can still find these sort of things like this brick cart. It's in a huge patch of poison ivy, so if you do go looking for it, don't wear sandals. There are some buildings in Picton and the surroundings. I've picked two here. This is the Regent Theatre Fly Tower, which is at the back of Regent Theatre on Main Street. And on the right, we have a home in Cherry Valley. This picture was taken before restoration started, and I know they've been doing restoration work for the last 2 years, so I'll probably have to replace that with a much nicer photograph of it as a restored property. The next major effect on the sand dunes was the completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway. For the first time, water levels could be controlled. And I put controlled in quotes for most of you who are familiar with the water levels in 2017. I won't get into that and laying any blame. But this was the formation of the International Joint Commission that oversaw water levels. And this began the erosion of the Westlake Bar. I'm showing here, this is the Moses Saunders Dam during 2017. And you can see all the spillways are open to try and lower the lake levels, which was not very successful because they could only let out slightly less water than was coming in at the time, which wasn't very useful. The damage was considerable, and I'm sure many of you have horror stories. I know the Yacht Club had a lot of issues with high water and getting around on duck boards and all that sort of stuff. This is a scene at the north end of the Westlake Bar, and it gives you an idea of how much the sand was eroded by the wave action. And the trees are in the water, and those trees will obviously never regrow, and eventually the sandbar will be breached. It was breached in a couple of places during 2017, but once that happens, there'll be devastation on Westlake. So I want to go back just again just to the people coming in. The reason that they had that provincial parks got involved in the area was a report by William Greenwood in 1954. Mostly about the outlet beach, because that was this popular spot that had the Palace of the Moon and people drinking and partying. There were no formal parking areas. The cars just drove onto the beach. There were no tables, nothing at all, no lifeguards, specifically no washroom facilities. And with 5,000 people using the outlet beach on a weekend, you can just imagine what it was like on a Monday morning. It was, I was never there, obviously, at that time, but I can imagine it was horrible. Here's a lovely old image showing the cars in the 30s on the beach. This is right at the mouth of the outlet river at Lake Ontario. And the lake level must have been quite low at that time because during 2017, there was no beach there at all. It was all underwater. This is just a very quick sort of summary of the park. It was the first part was the outlet beach. That was purchased in 57, became the Outlet Beach Provincial Park. By 1960, they started developing the Westlake Bar, the Sandbanks Provincial Park. And by 1984, the park had invested in buying all the land between the two parks, and the park was renamed Sandbanks Provincial Park. Let's move to the present. And we have, this year was the highest attendance rate ever at the park, over 700,000 visitors. And many of them came from Quebec because of international restrictions. They couldn't go south to the United States for their holidays. So there was more waste generated, more damage. If you talk to any local residents around County Road 12, they're not happy with how popular the park has become. And that's an ongoing problem, and I don't know how that's going to be resolved. On a cheerier note, here we have people enjoying the surf at the Lake Ontario beach. This is a view looking again from West Point, looking northeast to the sandbar and the sandbanks, and you can see how much vegetation is actually on the sandbanks there. So we're actually moving along to the good news about what hasn't happened. And in 1885, it was proposed to build a loop railway from Wellington to West Point that would bring in tourists and loop around the point and rejoin at Cherry Valley and go back to Picton. That never happened, which is probably a very good thing. In 1940 or so, someone proposed they would build a road to do the same. In 2020, the newspapers are suggesting that a nice pedestrian bridge would be a great idea. And I hope that never happens, because one of the joys of the Sandbanks is that if you want to be with 700,000 people, go to the outlet beach. If you don't want to be with 700,000 people, walk a couple of kilometers away from the Sandbanks beach, and I guarantee during the week you'll be on your own, which is the way I like it when I go to the beach. So in conclusion, I'd like to just mention it's often a combination of events. These are inevitably man-made events, and you have to remember that current events are just as important in changing the environment of the sandbanks, and we need to look for beyond simple solutions. Conservation, energy use, waste management. I should have emphasized common sense to preserve the landscapes such as the sandbanks. It's a beautiful spot. If you go, I personally wouldn't recommend going on a weekend in the summer, but if you go during the week and preferably before the season starts, it's a magical place, and it's a wonderful place to cleanse your soul. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. If you want to look at some information about our site and all the photographs I've taken about the Sandbanks, go to our website. The URL is there. And again, sorry, I promised it wasn't going to be another commercial plug, but this is charitable. So if you want to give us some money to fund our accessibility projects, that would be great. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Virtual clap. There we go, everybody.
Virtual clap.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It's funny. I was there the 29th, the Thanksgiving in 2019 to go camping, and we finally got a chance to explore over at the West Point. And so just kind of piecing it all together was really, really cool. Having actually stood at the side of the ruins of the Lakeshore Lodge, recall kind of reading the panels, but now being able to piece together the larger story is quite nice. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to remind everyone who's listening, any questions, please use the YouTube chat, or feel free to email your questions to marmuse@marmuseum.ca. That's marmus@marmuseum.ca. I'm just going to double check to make sure there's nothing not working on this end. There we go. Here. There we go. Operating two different screens myself, so it's flipping between everything.
Well, after another 100 of these, you should be pretty good at it.
Yes, it's one of those things. As soon as you start overthinking it, then you're constantly you're kind of thrown off balance by it. But I guess one of the questions I had was the work that you've done and the photos that you found, is it largely from families that have put them together, or from the local archives?
The majority of the pictures have come from local archives. I copied a lot of images from the MacDonald family, who had given most of their images to the park, along with quite a lot of documentation. I have over the years offered to digitize any images that people wanted of the park, and we had two sessions, one at the archives and one at the Legion, where people could bring in photographs and I would copy them right there, and the week later send them a DVD with all the images. And this was free, of course, but the only sort of catch was that if there was anything good about the Sandbanks, I was free to use it on our website or in presentations.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful idea, actually. Great way of gathering a bit more knowledge about it and exposure.
Yeah, all the images.
Resource.
Yeah, all the images, I'll just mark. All the images that I take are, as I say, available on the website, and all the archival images have been given to the Prince Edward County Archives, who I work with quite closely. I've got several projects on the go, including my video, the Danforth Road video, which I'm not shamelessly plugging right now, but it's my big project for 2021.
And is the Danforth project, that's part of the Sandbanks history?
Well, in a way, yes. It's more Prince Edward County history. It goes back to Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, who wanted to bring more settlers into Canada in 1790, 1795. And one of the things he needed to do was build roads. So he built a road from more or less Western Ontario to Toronto, York at the time. But then he decided he needed a road to connect York to Kingston. And he hired Asa Danforth. And Asa Danforth Jr. Was the son of Asa Danforth Sr., who was a very staunch American revolutionary. So it's very odd how this Asa Danforth Jr. actually got the contract for the road, but he did. And he started building it in 1799. and he got to Trenton, and then from Trenton he went down into the county through Consicon and Wellington and Picton down to Adolphustown, and then from Adolphustown, to Glenora, and then to Adolphustown, and then across to along the lake to Bath, where he stopped and joined onto the road that came from Kingston to Bath at that point. So I'm trying to trace the actual route. I'm doing a drive-through, basically driving it from east to west, with trying to match in old photographs to the present day. So that's been a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying that. And what's nicer? What could be nicer than doing a video and pretending to be working with a camera mounted in a convertible, just driving along on a summer's day? Really makes for easy work.
That sounds like a wonderful project, and certainly the
Yeah.
experience of going through that.
Yeah.
It's as you say, the befores and afters are always great to capture.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very unique. So I had a question come in from a participant, an attendee. What do you imagine the Sandbanks will look like in 50 years? Very interesting.
50
a lot of scope there.
50 years, I expect that it won't look much different. It will have more vegetation, and depending on what course the park takes as far as whether they're going to build new campgrounds or new parking areas, there's a real pushback from the county on expanding the park in any way, because it really is, it's very difficult for the residents now. They're looking at a lot of different solutions. The parking, I should just mention, for years you couldn't park on the roads surrounding the park, but it was a $30 ticket. So people just took that as that was the admission fee. That has now gone up to $300. But of course, the county doesn't have the enforcement to go around and ticket all these cars. If I had my way, you would hire someone, and that's all they would do. They would ticket, and they'd go around with a tow truck and tow them away right away. But I'm kind of hard line on that, because maybe because in a way it's a little unfair to people who come in cars, because if you walk in or bike in, even on a motorcycle, you can go in, and there's even when it's supposedly closed because it's so busy. But the answer to the question is probably not very much. It's not going to move very much. It's basically been established where it is. There'll be a certain amount of drifting, and it tend to fill into Westlake over not 50 years, but say 5,000 years. It's quite possible that Westlake will be filled in entirely, and the same with Eastlake and all these Baymouth bars. But that's very much predicated on the height of Lake Ontario. If it stays at 2017 levels or gets higher than that, then all bets are off as to what's going to happen, because it is a very, very fragile ecosystem, and high water is the second biggest problem after the destruction by man that has really exacerbated the drifting of the sand.
No, I expect it would. Thank you, John, for that. Right, so I'm going to give a last shout out for any other questions. And of course, if we happen to miss any of your questions, you're more than welcome to email the museum, marmuseum.ca, and we'll be sure to pass that along to John.
Yeah.
Oh, we got one last question here. Did the sand quarry have a detrimental effect on the marine environment? Very good question.
That is a good question. I don't think so. The sand quarry, they were restricted not to dig below water level. So while they removed the largest dune, which is now a very nice artificial pan with a lot of wildlife in it, I don't think there was any problem with aside from diesel fumes of trucks coming and going all hours of the day and night. There is a problem in Westlake with over-fertilization of farms and runoff of nitrogen, and we're getting to the point in Wellington where they're sort of their treatment facilities are more or less at their maximum, because Wellington has become such a popular place. A lot of places like I'm trying to think of the name of it. I call it the Wrinkle Ranch because it's a retiree community, which is not very, which isn't particularly flattering. But anyone who knows and lives in Wellington will know what I mean. But that's expanded, and there's a lot of new housing. Unfortunately, from a point of view of somebody who's fairly young, the housing is expensive. It's very expensive. You could have picked up a property 15, 20 years ago for next to nothing in the county, but now they're Toronto prices. It's really incredible. So that limits it. But as far as the water quality is probably better now than it's been in many years, especially in Westlake. I know the park tests twice a week at all their beaches, and I think they've only had one incident where they had to close the beach because of fecal coliform levels, and that again was partially due to the high water levels and a lot of the crap, literally, that came down from Toronto when the storm sewers overflowed, the sanitary sewers overflowed, or vice versa into the storm sewers. So.
Thank you very much for your questions, everyone. And thank you very much, John, for joining us this evening. Wonderful presentation. And as I said, it's so nice to be able to piece together those histories and the spaces that you're visiting and that you're experiencing, and get to know a bit more about what you're walking on or swimming in. So for everyone who's joining us, the next speaker is Stephen Med on the 10th of March with this presentation, If Lilacs Could Sing, featuring a combination of stories and performed ballads, actually, on local history. Information about the remaining speaker series can be found on our website at marmuseum.ca/nautical nights, and that link will be provided in the chat for you. Registration again is required, and for those of you who purchased our winter package, you're all covered. You'll receive the link. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I'd like to say then thank you very much, John, for joining us this evening. Thank you everyone for joining us from all over the country, it looks like, from our comments at the beginning. And I wish everyone a very positive and well week until next time. And thank you again so much for joining us. There you go.